Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to Murder One and to the Lexicon in Dún Laoghaire. We have a fantastic audience here this evening, and we have a fantastic audience online. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. We'll be taking your questions online through our social media a bit later, and obviously we'll be doing your audience questions later. I'll be back with the mic. We are sponsored, Murder One is sponsored this year by Dún Laoghaire Rethdown Libraries, which is why we're in such a fantastic location, and also by the Arts Council, and it's the Arts Council that are enabling us to live stream and to get out to so many people beyond this theatre. We have had a fantastic couple of days. I hope you've enjoyed the events that you've been to, those of you who've been to repeat ones. And we have a fantastic event to close with. I am going to leave you now with Declan Hughes and Mick Herron, and I shall be back a little later. Gentlemen, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello.
Thank you, Vanessa. Mick Herron was born in Newcastle and studied English at Oxford. He is the award-winning author of the Zoe Bowen PI series and the best-selling Slough House Jackson Lamb series, the first volume of which, Slow Horses, has been adapted and is currently airing on Apple TV. Mick, I think one of my favourite lines from your latest Slough House book, Bad Actors, is all those decades of the arms race, and it turned out there was no greater damage you could inflict on a state than ensure it was led by an idiot.
I was delighted to say that was put on a huge poster at the end of Westminster Bridge with an arrow pointing towards the House of Commons. In context, it was more of a kind of reference to the US election rather than a British one. But it fits. It fits the UK at the moment, I have to say.
Well, we think we know who it was about, but it's not getting any better, is it?
No, it isn't. I couldn't invent some of this stuff. If I decided I was going to invent a prime minister and say that in her first week in office, she was going to tank the UK economy, people would just call me a Ramona. They would say, that's not going to happen. But
you do have an uncanny facility for writing as if ripped from the headlines, the latest material. My wife said she has an image of you and Cold War Steve in a bunker somewhere under Westminster, receiving the latest intelligence and then
intelligence from Westminster.
Carving it up. Would you speak to that as a kind of method? Because it's been there from the first book, really.
Well, it has, but it's largely accident, really. I mean, there was a comment in Slow Horses, which I started writing in 2008, about departure from the European Union, which when I wrote it, I intended to show that the characters discussing this were completely crazy, And as it turns out, we ended up being led by completely crazy people, and they engineered this precise situation. So I'm not particularly happy about that reputation in a way, because I mostly write about catastrophes of one sort or another. To have them coming true isn't something that pleases me a great deal. But I write largely about incompetence and failure and stupidity, and for the past decade or more, they've been the prevailing condition under which the UK has been governed. So,
But you do know, or at least were contemporary with some of them, perhaps at Oxford?
I was there at the same time as, yes. I mean,
yeah, you weren't one of Simon Cooper's chums, but you saw them across the quad, or?
Indeed. I mean, I came from a state school in the northeast of England. I didn't really move in the same circles as Boris and his chums. No, not at all. But they were visible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ghislaine Maxwell was at college at the same time as me as well. I mean, it really was a golden generation.
Do you get any flack? Do you, as the, I mean, the first books weren't as big as the books are now. I mean, do messages come back to you from parties who think they see themselves? The prominent politician who I think you blew up, whose wife was a newspaper columnist.
No, I don't. Well, I don't do any social media, so I've got no idea really whether this is. I might have been cancelled for all I know. The last to find out. Not as far as I'm aware. I mean, I have had some. I get told by my publishers that there are some strange messages of. On Twitter and the like, of people who've enjoyed those. Michael Gove apparently tweeted that he was really enjoying the books. Up until London Rules, he's been very quiet since then.
Well, I guess he's out of the firing range now.
We hope so.
It seems to, and I mean, it's not just like taking pock shots at sort of Boris Johnson types. It's also, you know, when I started Bad Actors, we were in Russia with Russia as the prime mover 3 months into the Crimean War. Your antennae are very alert and contemporary. Martin Amis once taught about fiction, the job of the novelist being to capture the rhythms of the near future. And it seems to be part of your modus operandi to keep your ear to the ground, so to speak.
Unconsciously, I would say. I certainly don't attempt to do anything like that. I mean, I'm setting my books in what is essentially the real world, and reflecting the political backdrop of the time in which I am writing the book, the particular book. So I've been very lucky, I think, essentially, in some of the things that I've written as a throwaway comment, which have seemed to have great resonance a year or so later, but it's accidental. I think people look for it now in the books, and they make more of things than I ever intended to put in. I got told that in Slough House, I think it was, I kept referring to you-know-what. I decided I wasn't going to mention Brexit anymore, so I referred to it as you-know-what. And I got several people afterwards thought that I had predicted COVID. They thought that's what I was referring to, and I said, you-know-what.
Well, we appreciate your modesty, but we don't entirely trust it.
I'm not an entirely trustworthy person.
We prefer to think of you as a sort of English prophet of the way we live now politically. Let's go back to the early days. You grew up in Newcastle. You took an English degree at Oxford. When was writing on the horizon? For as long as you can remember?
For as long as I can remember. I mean, like most writers, I'm a reader first and foremost, and I read from a very young age. My mother was an infant school teacher, and she taught me to read before I attended school. So I was reading from really quite young.
Sure.
And I think that if you read too much, it renders you unfit for anything else whatsoever. So for me, when young, fiction was an escape. Not that I had anything bad to escape from, but there was always, storybook worlds were always very enticing, and so it became natural that I would want to take part in.
And what did you read as a child?
Anything that I could lay my hands on. So the usual children's fiction. A lot of Enid Blyton. I know she gets a bad press now, but she was a never-ending source of story.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that when you're young, that's what you want when you're a child. If you're just getting into that world, you want stories that will never stop. And quantity is far more important than quality as well. When you are young, you have to just read everything, and then you can sort out later what's good and what isn't.
She also wrote a kind of thriller and a kind of mystery. I'm a firm believer that most crime writers made the leap from Enid Blyton to Agatha Christie.
Yes, yeah. We were talking about this over dinner last night. I was talking about it with Anne Cleves. I was remembering once using a technique that I learned from an Enid Blyton book to get into my parents' house when I'd locked myself out coming back from school. And just the one where you slide a piece of newspaper under a door
and jiggle the key through.
It works. So it works, and it worked on that particular door.
That's the mystery of the secret room. That's a crucial.
So the things you learn from literature.
Invisible ink out of lemon juice.
Yeah,
exactly.
I haven't tried that one.
Yeah. And then you iron it, and it appears. And did you have a moment when you felt genre fiction of some kind rather than literary fiction? Or I know you read a lot of poetry. When maybe in your teens or 20s, when you started to make those choices about actually writing kind of in a serious way, what was that process?
I think as a teenager, it was short stories that I wrote, and then as a student and in the years immediately following, because I wrote first as well as reading it. I never published a collection. I published in magazines and the like, and then that just sort of stopped. It dried up. It wasn't that I wanted to stop. I just seemed to be unable to continue writing in that vein anymore. And so I turned to prose as a sort of second best, really, as a way of...
as a true poet would believe.
Yeah. I still think that poetry is the highest calling. And genre fiction because I love reading it. And it offers certain kind of strictures. It gives you a framework automatically, because you need to have an ending in in genre fiction, which you don't necessarily in kind of mainstream or literary fiction. You know, you can just write a slice of life or whatever with, you know, no particular start or finish point. But I needed to be able to end a book, so genre fiction was where I went.
I know writers often ridicule the question, where do you get your ideas? I remember listening to Andrew Taylor talking about his early writing years, where he knew he wanted to write, but he couldn't think of anything to write. And someone suggested a mystery novel, start with a dead body, and then he understood from that he would have something to write about before, who this person was, and something to write about afterwards, how that person, investigating the truth of the person's murder. And as he, and I think it's very writerly insight, as he began to accumulate pages, he began to find out other things about himself as a writer. So he was writing, it got him off the block, basically. Yeah.
Well, certainly in plotting, a lot of it is simply problem solving. You know, you can start off with a situation, and you have to engineer your characters into that situation and then engineer them back out of it again.
Sure.
So a lot of what a writer is doing is simply making sure, when creating a plot, simply making sure that a particular character is in a particular place at a particular time, possessed of a certain piece of information which they will either then disclose or withhold to somebody, and that will cause a reaction. Authors essentially are just PAs to a lot of imaginary people that are making sure that they're in the right places doing all this stuff.
So tell me how the Zoe Bohm books evolved. They were the first writing, and also in industry insight. I know all too well that English editors and PI fiction don't mix as smoothly as that subgenre does in America. So was there an issue in navigating that?
Not especially an issue. I mean, I didn't have a readership. Nobody was reading the books. It came about more or less by accident. I mean, I wrote they're more thrillers than crime novels, really, because I don't plot quite in that way. I don't solve mysteries in the books. You know, I find out what happens next. And Zoe came up quite accidentally, really, in the first book. She's a very minor character who appears towards the end. And when it came to writing a second novel, it took me quite a while. I was quite a way into thinking about the book, and I knew it would involve a private eye. Before it occurred to me that I'd already invented a private eye in the previous book, even though she only had a small role, and I could just use her again, and that's how that came about. And then she appeared in a couple more novels, and I've never really said goodbye to her.
Yeah.
In fact, I wrote Slough Horses, which was intended to be a sort of standalone. And I was going to return to writing another Zoe novel afterwards, and that just never happened. I got very caught up in that world and never went back. I had a collection of short stories published last year, and I think four of them are Zoe stories, quite long, and mostly written since the last Zoe novel. And I realised that that's when I realised I hadn't really said goodbye to her properly,
Right.
so maybe I'll return to her one day with a farewell.
When you started Slough Horses, what came first, the Slough House or Jackson Lamb?
Slough House, which is a real place in as much as it's a building I used to walk past every day on my way to work. It was just near the tube station where I lived. This is fantastic. I heard this from my sister-in-law just a few days ago. Slough House is now on Google Maps. Believe it or not. It's listed as a government office.
Yeah.
And it's there. I don't know how that came about, but it's absolutely delightful. So it's and if those of you who've seen the TV show, when they show the outside, they do an external shot. That is actually the building that I used to walk past. They got permission to use the actual. The owners allowed them to use that as the exterior. They built a set for the inside, but it really is the place that that fascinated me for no reason I could at the time put my finger on.
Yeah.
I've learned a bit more about it since. A couple of years ago, I was asked to write a piece for The Guardian, one of those, the street where I grew up or something like that.
Yeah.
And I realised that the front door of Slough House, the reason that it fascinated me was it's pretty much identical to the front door of the house that I lived in until I was about 8. We lived in flats above my father's optician's shop.
Okay.
And it was on a busy main road, and it was a sort of very grubby, dirty, black front door. And that must be why this place. I realised it sort of years afterwards.
Feel a
why that
Gothic
triggered me.
cross cut between the two doors and spooky music in the background. Yeah, and the idea of these sort of penitent incompetents serving out their time. Did that come to you immediately, or?
I think it sort of evolved quite quickly, I think. I mean, the ideas of failure and incompetence come more naturally to me, certainly at that time in my life, than success and efficiency.
Yeah.
So I knew I was going to be right about people who weren't necessarily very good at what they did. And I knew they were going to be sort of working. I wanted a group of people to write with. I wanted to move away from having written novels essentially about one character and what happened to her.
Yeah.
So I wanted an ensemble piece. And the characters evolved in different sorts of ways. The first scene in which Lamb appears, he appears at the doorway when River Cartwright is upending a bagload of rubbish on his office floor and sorting through it. Now, when I wrote that scene, I knew who River's mother was, I knew who his grandfather was. I knew instances from his childhood, none of which had been on the page yet, but I knew all that because I'd done that work. I didn't know anything about Lamb except what kind of shape he was. I knew he was a big man. I knew he was a former spy. I knew he was the boss. And so when I started writing him, I was starting to learn about him from that moment. And the first thing I learned about him was that although he was a big man, and I know that Slough House is full of creaky stairs, he appeared there without making a sound, and that really startling River. So that was sort of new information to me.
Right.
And the way that I wrote him from then on. I wasn't working off a list that I'd worked with beforehand. It was just creating the character on the page. So the boorishness and the flatulence and all the drinking and smoking, they were things that I realised that's what he was going to do more or less when he started doing them, as I was writing the sentences.
Yeah. You said Andy DL was a kind of inspiration, but did that come after the fact? Sometimes
after
it does.
The fact.
You realise you've written someone that
take a step back and look what you've created, and it's very evident that some of that was coming from Reginald Hill's wonderful work. I remember not that long ago, a few years back, reading one of Andrew Taylor's spy novels, and he's got a character who really is quite similar to Lamb, written several years beforehand. Yeah. And I said to Andrew, because he was one of the first to review me in a magazine for the third book. He wrote a lovely review, it's fantastic. And I said to him, if that had been me, I might have said, this is quite familiar stuff. And he cited Hill as well. He said, well, we're all drawing from the same well, really. Yeah. And Reginald Hill, I was never lucky enough to meet. He would have cited, Falstaff.
Well, I was about to say,
it's an archetype, really.
Pretentiousness, yes, that is an English archetype. Yeah.
So I don't make great claims for having invented an original character. I don't feel that I have. I feel that I've sort of burnished work that other writers have already performed.
It strikes me that the concept of these failures, these people who've made a fatal flaw and are seeking to work it off, seeking for grace, seeking redemption. That is, in most of the best genre fiction, what the protagonists are doing. You don't just want a detective to solve the crime. You want to be. It's part of his or her quest to solve themselves, invariably. And it seems, with Slough House, I think that's one of the reasons it's so satisfying. Is they're all in this together and they're all up front. We know each of them is a rundown, and they're trying to climb back up.
And they've all been told over and over again that they're never going to make it, but they all believe they will be the exception to that particular rule.
Yeah. And we do as well, I suppose, do we? Sometimes, depending on who it is.
I don't.
But yeah. Okay. I suppose that's because the power of Jackson Lamb is he's a kind of Lord of Misrule, and that cynicism is the element that you feel occasionally. I think it's at odds with. I mean, River Cartwright you can see in a Le Carre novel. He's the honourable or dishonourable schoolboy on one level. If Le Carre had written women, maybe Catherine Standish might have popped up somewhere. But Jackson Lamb, no.
No.
And that comic streak, which is the other signal, which we were alluding to earlier with the rip from the headline stuff, but it's richer and more antic than that, I think. And I wonder, do you have a sense of where that's coming from?
It's very kind of you to say so, thanks. I don't really, except that it became the tone of voice I used to write these books. It's not quite the same as the tone I've used in other books.
Yeah.
And it seemed appropriate on one level for writing about these characters, because take that kind of black humour away,
Yeah.
then what you've got is a bunch of frustrated people leading very unhappy lives,
Yeah.
going nowhere in their careers. And who wants to read that? You know, it's very quickly become quite bleak.
Sure.
So the humour is there to kind of buoy that up a bit, because I think it's how people respond to going. Many people respond to going through dark times in their lives. You know,
Absolutely,
they have to make a joke out of it.
But it's like, I mean, I think I compared it at one point to very early Tom Sharp, who I think even back then was being cancelled within a couple of books. But there's a kind of broad farceur's eye, which linked to these really kind of kinetic plots. It just becomes exhilarating, that whole rush, you know, but never seems to break out of. It's very much in tension with a streak of kind of yearning melancholy and romanticism. Those apostrophes at the beginning of each book, you know, there's the characters like River, like Catherine, who are connected to a kind of past and have a sense of a tradition, or what we would call a kind of yearning English quality. Yeah,
there's certainly melancholy there, because melancholy is more interesting to write than happiness, apart from anything else, and it allows for more lyrical flights, which I'm quite prone to in many ways. But it's not as if I have an overall picture of what I'm trying to do. I'm writing it sentence by sentence, really, and seeing where it goes.
Sure. How big, I've already mentioned him, how big of an influence was Le Carre?
Well, I mean, enormous. Nobody can write spy fiction without doing so. Not so much in his shadow. I like to think of it as being the light that he cast. You know, he did create this extraordinary world. I don't think he'd have enjoyed what I do. I think he'd have probably found it facetious, really. But there was particularly the great spy novels are not only about the Cold War, they were written during the Cold War, I think, and everything that's happened since is an attempt to kind of recapture that glory or pay homage to it in some way, or try to do something different, which generally doesn't come off as well as those great books. But there were two different strands of fictional spies, really. There's the James Bond, it's all, you know, great fun, you know, car chases and parachute jumps. And he walks into any 5-star hotel in the world and the bartender is going to be shaking him a drink before he reaches the bar. Which does call into question the nature of secret in Secret Agent.
That's right, yes.
But there
they always know who he is, don't
That's
they?
right, yeah. And then there's the other, the Le Carre type of man, and it's always a man, who's worked, you know, run the Secret Service for 20 years. And every evening he goes home to his wife, who thinks he works for the gas board. And that has a really huge appeal, I think, because we don't all have, you know, secret identities, but we all have inner lives that nobody else is privy to.
Yeah.
And so that, you know, the idea of that kind of the cover life, the cover story, and the real individual, the real identity beneath that, is really what most novels are about. Novels are how we find out what other people, even if fictional people, are thinking and feeling. I mean, generally speaking, we know what people say and what they do, but unless they share it with us, we don't know what people's thoughts and feelings are.
Yeah.
Fiction is how we explore those things through empathy. And it's a very small shift from there to the spy novel. That's what the spy novel is about. It's about the secret identity at the heart of this, you know, apparently ordinary lives, you know, in the Le Carre world that have all this turmoil going on underneath.
Sam Leith, reviewing you, suggested that you share with Le Carre the one recognition that espionage is in large part a matter of office politics rather than fancy gizmos and gadgetry.
Well, that's I don't know anything about fancy gizmos and gadgetry. So office, I have worked in an office for all my working life. So that's, you know, the experience that I draw on and apply to the fiction that I'm writing. So my spies are essentially sort of office drones. I write if I could get away with it, I'd just write whole novels about them squabbling over what's in the fridge, you know, and that would satisfy me.
How much did you know about espionage before you started?
Only what I read in Le Carre and I'd seen in James Bond. You know?
That's interesting. You've spoken also about the cadences you occasionally adopt as feeling just right for spy fiction betray Le Carre's influence.
When I fall into those particular rhythms, and I recognise them sometimes, I do feel that, you know, A, I'm kind of trying to adopt his voice, and B, that's the right sort of voice to write this sort of fiction in. I mean, he really does seem to me to have written the ideal spy novels. I mean, I think that Tinker Tailor and Smiley's People in particular. I doubt I'll ever read a better spy novel than either of those. And it's not so much, I mean, it is the stories that he's telling, but it's the way he tells them, it's the tone of voice that he uses, and it's those cadences, and it's very English, I think. And there's melancholy there as well. I mean, there's a great sadness at the heart of what he's writing, I think. And they just seems, there's something about it. And it's possibly got as much to do with how old I was when I first read them and fell in love with them, you know. That to me, they're what the spy novel is. So generally speaking, if I'm writing and I find that I'm sounding like another writer, which can happen quite easily, especially if I've been reading somebody with a very strong style. If I've been reading, you know, Kingsley Amis, for instance, or Chris Brookmeyer, somebody who has a very strong voice, I can find myself sort of writing the kind of sentences that they might have written. And when I catch myself doing that, I will change it because I don't want to sound like anybody else. When I catch myself sounding like Le Carre, I often think, I don't mind sounding like Le Carre.
I think you say the occasional borrowed rhythm as part of the bridge building writers do, and that made sense to me. That sense that you are taking a kind of an essence or a flavour and moving it on yourself. So there's
all fiction writing, I think, is taking part in a dialogue with the other books that you've read throughout your life and trying to go someplace different with them. So yes, bridge building is a good image for it.
In everyone's first novel, we can see what they've been reading for the previous 5 or 10 years.
And the process of finding your own voice. You're a lucky writer if you find your own voice with your very first book, I think. I mean, some do, but...
Where do you think, I'm interested in Le Carre as well, his reputation for, I mean, he's hated by the right in the UK. But there's, I know Julian Simmons, who's a lifelong left-wing critic, did not like those books, the kind of Smiley trilogy, and because he felt they were nostalgic and implicitly conservative. Whereas he approved Spy Who Came In From the Cold and a couple of the later books. And I thought that was a fascinating kind of take on Le Carre.
I hadn't come across that. It is interesting, and I can see that there's some truth in that, because there is a kind of yearning and grieving in those books for a world that slipped out of our reach. I don't think he was yearning for empire or anything like that, but for... Well, I think he wrote himself, you know, the Britain having lost its role in the world, you know, and not knowing what to turn to in its place. And there is a sadness in that, I think. Well, there was then, you know.
Can we talk a little bit about the trade? You become an overnight success after 15 years. Slow Horses was published by Constable, I think.
That's right,
and then they didn't pick up the second book.
That's right,
Talk me through the process until eventually John Murray kind of came out.
Well, you pretty much said it all. Constable at that time had a relationship with an American publisher called Soho Press. When Constable decided they didn't want to publish Dead Lions, and actually at that point I didn't want Constable to publish Dead Lions because I didn't think they were doing anything with the books. They were publishing them. I did receive a copy, you know. I knew it was there.
Like you said, they dropped them out the window.
I don't think I ever saw another copy anywhere. Certainly not at a bookshop. But they didn't want deadlines, and as it turned out, no other publisher in London did. I think it went to most of them, because, and I can understand why, it's quite difficult to sell a sequel to a book that nobody read when you can't sell them the paperback rights to the book that nobody read, the first book either, because Constable had them at that time. So, it just wasn't going to happen. But Soho Press in the States continued to publish them, which was great. So there's no UK first edition of hardback first edition of Deadlines. And then I wrote a standalone, which was slight part of the same world, called Nobody Walks, which also only appeared in the States then as a hardback. And then I'd written Real Tigers. It hadn't yet appeared. It hadn't yet been published when a young publisher called Mark Richards, who'd just been appointed at John Murray, got in touch. He'd come across the book across an American paperback of Slough Horses in a railway station bookshop, I think it was, at Liverpool Street. And the reason he looked at it was because he knew it was an American paperback, and he didn't know what it was doing. It was just a strange thing to say. I've got no idea what it was doing there. It was quite weird. So he bought it anyway and read it, and then it was just before the London Book Fair of 2015, I think. It might be 2016. I'm not good on dates. And he approached my American publisher and said, "Can we do a deal here? Can we take the UK rights and publish these books?"
Yeah.
And my American publisher spoke to me about it, and she said, "I think it might be quite good for you if this happens." So Mark came and took me out to lunch. I was in Oxford. I was writing the fourth book at that time, Spook Street. As I say, the third one hadn't appeared. And he was, he was very nice and very enthusiastic. And I didn't think anything was going to happen. I said, "Yeah, sure, we'll do it then."
Yeah.
And assumed that this would sort of amount to nothing in the end. And later that year, I think he published in paperback Slough Horses and Deadlines at the same time, and they disappeared without a trace. I mean, completely sank without a trace. But I hadn't taken into account what kind of man he was, Mark. He was a great believer in his own tastes, and he thought, "I think these books are good. Everybody else should like them too." And he just carried on publishing them until other people started reading them as well. He and his then PR person, Yassine Balkasimi, who's now my editor, carried out an extraordinary campaign with Real Tigers.
Yeah.
And they made sure that in a counterintuitive way, they put it on the desks of a whole load of other publishers in London and agents, people who had no vested interest in it at all.
Yeah.
But
I remember it arriving with the two paperbacks and a glossy. It was like Christmas Day, and really a lot of books come in the door, and you're like, "Please get them out of the way."
Yeah, quite, yeah.
And he made it an event. It was a brilliant act of publishing, Writers praise publishers in event. Shock.
I mean, people say, there was a word of mouth success, but the work and the strategy that went into creating that word of mouth was quite extraordinary.
Because even as "Oh, listen, they're trying to do a number on me here," it's like, but it's a good attempt. I'll certainly give it a chance, And so that was and Real Tigers was my first, and that was
And it kind of grew from there. It had the support of a lot of independent bookshops, and reviewers were very kind. I'd never been reviewed before. I had a review in one national paper with the very first book, and it was about 15 years later before I got a second review in a national paper. Yeah.
So let's slide on to the TV series. When I read Real Tigers, I thought, "Oh, Michael Gambon," for Jackson Lamb. That was who I had in mind. Now, even then, Michael Gambon was a little too old and was about to retire. Gary Oldman's not such a bad alternative.
No, he's doing a grand job, isn't he?
Yeah.
There was no shortage of sort of overweight actors of a certain age who would be quite happy to swear and fart on screen for a bit. So I think there's a lot of people who could have done it, but Gary's really made it his own. It's lovely to watch.
And the nice detail of it is having played Smiley in the...
That thrilled me to bits, obviously.
Yeah. It's such a great cast. I mean...
It's extraordinary. I mean, Kristen Scott Thomas in there as well. It's just lovely. I don't particularly write with actors in mind, or indeed with much of an image in my head of what these characters look like. Mostly I'm just writing for the page. I'm writing the voice in my head into the words on the page. The only character I had a really strong visual image of was River Cartwright. And the guy they cast as as River, Jack Loud, and he is the absolute image that I had in my head. It's extraordinary.
Yeah, it's very much who I thought it would be as well. Yeah, that type. And it's funny, I don't necessarily always want to cast a novel, but there was something very visual, very cinematic. I think that's why they lend themselves so well to adaptation. How closely or not involved are you?
Reasonably closely. I've not written any of it, and didn't want to, because I'm a prose writer, and I think writing screenplays is an entirely different skill set. It's not one that I have. It's not one that I really want to learn. Yeah. I'm at the stage where if I learn anything new, I have to forget something old, and I really don't want to do that anymore. But I've worked with the writers. There are 4 of them, and I've been in the writers' room, and I've been there when the series are being plotted, so the scene by scene on a big whiteboard in this big room we use, and that's great fun. And I was surprised. I was very nervous about going in the first time I went in, but I found it really energizing, and I came out of it looking forward to getting back to work on the books, because I think it was because listening to people discuss these characters as if they were real people and working out what they would do next, it was a lovely experience.
You already dramatize, you know. I mean, these books are full of action, whether it's verbal or dynamic, kinetic chase sequences or whatever. So that's half the battle. What else involved in? I mean, because I didn't make a close comparative study, but Slow Horses felt to me like, oh, this is the book. You know, are there extras? How would you describe the differences? Or
well, a lot of the time they've got to get the interiority of the text onto the screen. Because I write a lot of time in characters' heads. I'm telling you, particularly a character like Catherine, who doesn't necessarily say very much, but I'm in her mind a lot. So, what she thinks and feels can take up quite a lot of space on the page. How you translate that into, a visual drama can be quite, I thought would be quite tricky. But of course, what I hadn't really realised is how much work actors do. It's quite extraordinary. When you've got someone like Saskia Reeves playing that part, what she can do with an expression is just, it's like magic. Yeah. So there's a lot of that. There's also, to be quite frank about it, if you're paying an actor a lot of money to be in a show, you want to use them as much as possible. So Jackson Ann will appear in more scenes on the TV, doing more stuff than he does on the page. Right. In the books, generally, he's just back in his office, drinking himself stupid. On the screen, you'll see more of him doing more stuff. He can drive cars and things, and walk up and down, and that kind of thing, just to make sure that we're getting our money's worth, really.
That's funny, yeah.
But when you've got someone like Gary Oldman, you just want to use him as much as possible. Yeah, he's a delight to watch.
Yeah. And my understanding is they've already shot Dead Horses?
They do shoot Dead Horses, don't they? Deadlines streams on December the 2nd.
Okay, great.
Real Tigers is being filmed now, and Spook Street starts filming in February. I think they film them back to back. Yeah. So they filmed. They did a year's shoot to get the first 2 books down. So they showed Slow Horses back in the spring, and the second one, it's been in the can for a while. But
right.
They've been,
Great. Well, that's something to look forward to. We have a fair few writers in the audience, and some writers who haven't declared themselves yet. So I wanted to ask you maybe a last question about your process. How do you go about, first of all, your writing day, but then also how would you start? Are you a planner? Where would you begin with a book? How long would it take? Drafts, all of that stuff.
Ooh, lots of questions all in one. I do have a process. It's quite hard to describe what it is, I think, because so much of it is just sitting down, trying yes, trying to put words on the page. I try to avoid the empty page. Before I start writing a book, I won't write page 1. I'll write scenes, I'll write dialogue. If I've got new characters in particularly, I'll write about them. I do as much as I can in fragments, and sometimes almost full scenes, which I don't always end up using in the book. I'm trying to avoid the idea that I write page 1 and I know I've got another 300 pages to write. When I write page 1, I've generally got about 50 or 60 pages of stuff there, which I think I can use. I don't plot. I'm not a plotter really, except I do know various things that are going to happen in the book. I have key stations that I know that I've got to arrive at, and it's a matter of finding the right details to get me from station to station, essentially.
Right.
And then I think that I have the end in mind, and what I usually find out is that I don't have an ending. There's simply a point at which I've stopped thinking about it.
Yeah.
And I reached that point with a novel I'm working on at the moment a couple of weeks ago, and reached there and you would have thought, okay, the novel is done. The novel isn't done. The novel's about 3/4 done. I've got to work out what happens now in the next, for however many thousand words it is. And so at the moment, the work I've been doing lately is actually plotting, but at quite a late stage.
Yeah.
And trying to make sense out of what I've written so far. I've spent the past year writing.
And is that always consecutive, or is some of it retrospective, where you have to...
At the point where I start writing page 1, I try to keep it consecutive. But it depends. With Bad Actors, the most recent novel, there's a long section in the middle, which is a flashback. And when I started writing the book, I realized quite quickly that I had to write the flashback before I wrote anything else, because otherwise I wasn't going to be able to make sense of either what happened then or what was happening now in terms of the novel. Other than that, I do tend to try and keep it consecutive, but I don't have rules about it. If I want to write a particular scene, then I'll just go for it. Right. But I found I have a limited amount of creative energy per day, and it's not geared towards a word count. It's just there comes a point where I just can't do any more. So I try to write as much as I can, but 1,000 words would be it, really. And by and large, that's a good day. Do
you limit yourself by hours, or do you always work in the morning, or do you...
Anything I do happens between, I'm going to say 9 and 5. It's more like 10 and 4, really.
Yeah.
And a lot of that time is spent reading and listening to music. Well, listening to music while writing. Creative napping, very important to be able to nap. And I don't know, it just... Yeah.
And do you work
ends up getting done,
Do you work at home, or...?
No, I have the flat where I lived in until the first lockdown. My partner and I have been together for quite a time, but until lockdown we didn't actually live in the same house. We lived quite close to each other. Yeah. But first day of lockdown number 1, I moved into the house with Joe, and now I go to the flat where I used to live to write. That's now just my writing place.
Okay. And that
so that's quite nice. That has no Wi-Fi or anything, so I go there and I'm completely detached. I just get on with the work, and nobody knows how many biscuits I eat.
Do you bring your phone? Do you bring a phone?
I do bring a phone, yes, but I don't have a smartphone, so I don't have any.
You don't have a smartphone.
No.
Okay, you're putting it up to the writers, I think. Fantastic. What's next? Is the next book a Slough House book?
No. It's a spy novel, and it overlaps here and there, but it's a standalone.
Part of the Mick Herron universe.
I guess it's not on Google Maps yet, but who knows? Yes, that'll be out next September, I think. I deliver it in February. I'm still working on it.
Right. And Slough House to continue?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I haven't killed everybody yet, so we'll carry on for a while.
And then just a couple of quick questions. What's on your nightstand? What are you reading?
What am I reading? On my Kindle at the moment, I'm reading Sarah Vaughan's new book. The title has just gone straight out of my head as soon as I said that.
I have
it's a one-word title.
And I can't remember what it's called.
Reputation. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Yes. Gold star, Catherine Ryan Howard, writer.
That's what I'm reading at the moment. And the book I'm most banging on about when anybody listens at the moment is Joanna Quinn's novel, The Whalebone Theatre. Has anybody read that? Wonderful novel. Yeah. And that was a debut. It's not a crime novel. It's a fantastic book that came out earlier this year. What I'll read next, there's a lot of good stuff coming, just been published, I think, both in the crime field. The new in Rankin is wonderful.
It is. I've just reviewed it. It's fabulous. Yeah.
It is. It is great. Yes. Anne Cleeve's new one is marvelous. Yeah. There are new books. Kate Atkinson has a new one out, which I haven't yet read. Yes, there's a lot of exciting stuff around.
Plenty to read. Yeah. I can see Vanessa is in sight, and that means questions.
It does indeed. I'm just going to take one from online first because they have been flying in. How do you get into the head of your female characters, Mick? That's one of the questions that came in.
I don't really differentiate as much as you might think when I'm writing female characters. I mean, I don't write, I'm now going to write as a woman and it is Catherine. I just think I'm now going to write Catherine. I'm now going to write Shirley. And I know what these people are like, and I know what kind of behaviours they have. I love writing someone like Shirley, but I'm not writing, a woman who is Shirley. I'm just writing Shirley. So I just pretend that we're all equal, really, in that weird kind of way. that's how it goes.
Inside, get that going. That's fantastic. And then we've just one more, well, we got one more, but this I'm going to ask now. What's your earliest memory of wanting to write crime? What sets you off?
Oh Lord, I don't know. It's probably one of the Noddy books. There's one where there's a bank robbery. Yeah, that would be it.
An early starter.
Yeah.
Excellent. Fantastic. Now, ladies and gentlemen, any questions in the audience? Yeah, as I say, stunned into silence again. Here we go. I'll come up here.
Just wondering what music you mentioned. You listen to music. What music do you listen to when you're writing?
I found out quite a long time ago that I didn't like listening to anybody singing when I'm writing, because I don't want anybody else's words in my head. So I listen to a lot of jazz, and I like listening to improvised jazz because there's no lyrical connotations at all. But I started listening to more classical as well, largely contemporary classical. Ava Part I listen to a lot. The musician I probably listen to more than anyone else over the past few years is Keith Jarrett. I love listening to his improvised live performances. I think they're extraordinary. So that kind of thing, something that I can put on. It will go on for quite a long time and have different kinds of moods going on in it. Upbeat and melodic. Often melancholy, that feeds into the books, I think. But nothing, words, unless they're, if they're something that I don't understand. I've got an Estonian choral music, for instance, is fine because I've got no idea what they're saying. And it sounds nice.
That's fascinating. You're the second writer to say about not listening to music with no lyrics. I think Brian McGilloway was said something similar. I'm just coming down to the front here to the next question. There we go.
I have to stand up. I have two questions. One of them is, or the first one is about your fondness for killing off some of the reader's favourite characters, and I want you to explain yourself. And I won't say, in case anybody hasn't read all the books, I won't say who, but some of them have been very, very painful. And the second one is, I remember reading a few books ago a review in the Sunday Times, I think, where the reviewer, I can't remember who it was, and it wasn't Declan Hughes because he wouldn't have done anything like that. It was where he was saying something like, well, these books are really good and he's a very good writer, but this obsession with seeing danger coming from the right, and when he really should know that the real danger is ISIS and all of that kind of thing. I can't remember who it was or how exactly he put it, and I'm just wondering, do you feel vindicated now?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, I do. I didn't actually read that review. I try to avoid them. I can understand why someone might think that, but I tend to be writing about domestic stuff. I am writing more about politics, and that's the machinery of the books. And I have put more traditional villains in my work. I don't feel, though, that I have to make up, sort of fantasy monsters like, lizard people or the anti-growth coalition or some, deranged nonsense like that. I can just write about the politics at large. There's plenty of bad things going on domestically without having to invent stuff. As for killing characters off, it's not something that I do lightly, and it's partly, it was there right from the beginning. One of the reasons I wanted to write a large cast was that I knew I would have the ability to do that. But I don't decide in the middle of writing a book, I know I'll kill one of these people off just to, give the plot a bit of vavoom. It's always one of the things I mentioned before. That'll always be one of the things that's a station in the novel before I start writing it. If I know if I'm going to kill a character, that is going to be the main event of any particular novel. And I don't quite know how the decisions come about. It's they arrive kind of fully formed, as it were. There have been times when I've thought, do do I really want to do this to this character? But I think that it would be untrue to the novel that I'd started writing to change my mind about doing something like that as well. Partly also it's to make room for new characters coming in. I don't regret any of the characters, some of whom I was very fond of killing them off. I do miss them in many ways because, although I don't in any sense believe in them as real people, things like creative, they're voices that I no longer have access to. I can no longer use that particular voice and that particular outlook in a book if I kill the character off. So it's something that I mourn too. But I think it adds something to the books, that sense of danger. You don't have to kill many people off before any character I put in danger, readers are going to worry about, because I have that reputation. And that helps me in writing the books. Yeah. So, sorry, not sorry is probably the right answer.
Excellent answer. Oh, we've got one up here.
You mentioned you don't have a smartphone, is that correct?
Yeah.
What does your editor or publisher think of it? Part of me admires it, but do they feel you might lose a certain audience or gain others?
Because we talked a bit about how I came to be published by John Murray. I mean, I think of myself as a rescue author. My career had gone nowhere. They did all this great stuff for me, but they also knew that there was no point in trying to teach me new tricks. I spent more than 10 years being very used to having a very low-key stuff. I don't do social media or anything like that. And they just let me get on with it. I mean, that was one of the things that Mark was so good at. He said when he was persuading me, didn't have that much persuasion, when he was persuading me to let them start publishing these books, he was sort of saying, you just carry on doing what you're doing and we'll do everything else. And they've stuck to that. So I haven't had to upgrade my phone, which is handy. As I say, I don't like learning new things. I don't want to forget all the old stuff.
Any more questions? Oh.
Jackson Lamb as a people manager in an office. Who inspired you?
Luckily, nobody. I've never worked with anybody like that. I did meet someone who could have been Jackson. Some years after I'd written Slough Horses, it was my South African publisher, who's sadly no longer with us. The one, I mean, he was very, very funny, and he would say outrageous things. I paid a visit to Cape Town and Johannesburg, and he was there hosting me for much of that time. And he would say outrageous things, so politically incorrect, you wouldn't believe it. The difference was that his staff loved him. He had a heart of gold, and everybody loved him. And that was the difference. That's not something I have with Jackson, certainly. But other than him, I've never come across a real life. Luckily, nobody I ever worked with was like that. Yeah. They were all lawyers, so I have to say that.
Good question. Any more? How are we doing? Oh, yeah, up here.
Hi.
Hi.
Some of the most beautiful prose that I've read from you are your descriptions of Slough House in the beginning of the books, like a cat coming in or dawn coming in to Slough House. Where do you get those ideas?
This is the frustrated poet in me coming to the surface, I think. Those are the bits, they're probably the hardest work to write. But I love writing those bits. And it's become a kind of a challenge to me to find a different way of getting into each book. There's something, I mean, I'm a writer because I love playing with language, essentially, and I really enjoy finding, different kinds of, different jingles, different moods, different kinds of word music to play in those opening and closing passages. But I don't really know where it comes from, and I try not to analyze it. I fear that I would break something if I sat down and thought about it rather than sat down and did it. But thank you. Yeah, they are the bits that are probably most important to me, I think.
That's wonderful. Now, any more questions? How are we doing? I'll come down. Oh, yeah, super.
At this stage in the books, the slow horses are actually very competent at what they're doing. Like, they have solved the 3 or 4 plots against, the UK or whatever. They're not actually failures per the plots, although they might be seen by, Regent's Park or whatever. Is that something you're kind of aware of?
You have put your finger on the big weakness in the whole series.
The best question comes at the end, the trick question. I wish I'd thought of that one.
I always say it's like the famous 5 books. These characters, every time they go on holiday, they catch a bunch of smugglers. I'm writing about these people who aren't supposed to do anything, but they always get involved in these escapades. But most people are too polite to mention it, frankly. I do intend to write a book where nothing happens, and that will ease my conscience.
That's it.
Here we go. We've another one online. Actually, somebody's asking how you get into the head of a troubled spy. I don't know how you
Into the head of troubled spies.
of a troubled spy. Indeed, I think it's a similar question.
I
to
think that's
before.
just my natural mindset. I relate more to sort of failure and incompetence than I do to the more successful types of spy. Because I think we all do, don't we? I mean, we all like to think that, when danger strikes, we'd be up there and really competent about battling it. But I'd be hiding under a table, frankly, and,
I'd be there first.
And I just aim for the lowest common denominator, really.
Excellent. Any more questions? Because I've got one, if nobody else has. I just want to ask, I read the start, I've read the whole thing, but the start of This Is How It Happened has the most incredible tension. It's about, for those who haven't read it, it's about a girl who's going to plant a USB device up in a building. She has to go up to the top floor. But when she comes down, she sets the fire alarm off. I hope that's not a spoiler. And she comes downstairs, and at one point she bends to tie her lace. And I nearly died reading that because the tension is absolutely palpable. Do you use any particular techniques to do that, or is that just the way it comes in your head?
The techniques really are to write it and then take out everything that you possibly can, I think, when you're writing any kind of action sequence or trying to generate that kind of tension. Make sure that there's nothing there to distract from what you want to be focused on, the action that's happening. That particular book is the only one that I've plotted from start to almost finish. I deliberately left the last chapter blank because I wanted that to develop organically. But the rest of it, there are 5 chapters, each of which are split into 2. So I had 8 sections that I knew what was happening beat by beat, page by page. And that was the easiest book to write that I've ever written, in as much as every time I sat down each morning, I knew what I was going to be writing about that day. You'd think I'd have learned from that and continued with that technique. I think what happened was that with that book, essentially it's 3 characters. And with this series, I have so many more characters. I can't do that. I can't hold all that in my head at once. I have to do it, on the page and feel the rhythms develop in their own way. But that's my shortest book. And it's the one I'm proudest of, I think, because as all the writers here will know, there's a metric for measuring the success of a book, which is only available to the writer, and that's the gap that exists between what you wanted to write and what you actually ended up writing. And with This Is What Happened, that gap is narrower than with any of the other books. And so for that reason, it's the one that I'm proudest of in an odd way.
Absolutely phenomenal. And that scene, honestly, I really nearly died. She just bends down. You can all read it yourself. You can pop upstairs and to the bookshop and pick up a copy, which Mick will sign, and read it yourself. But honestly, she bends down to tie her lace. Woo! Goodness, wasn't expecting that. That's fantastic. Have we any more? One more? I think we're time for just a minute for one last question. Oh, 2.
Hi. I read the first book and then I listened to all the rest of them on audiobook, and I have to say that Sean Barrett, it was just an extraordinary.
Isn't he amazing?
Yeah. Really. And I was wondering how much input you had into that. And I have a slightly very vague second question, which was because I'm terrible with names. One of the characters I love the most is a little side character. She's the researcher in the bowels of MI5.
Oh, Molly Doyle.
Molly, yes. I don't know if I'm making this up in my own head, but I felt there was like a correspondence between her and the sort of slightly grotesque researcher character in Le Carre's books.
that was one of the things that I noticed after I'd created her. I think I put her into Dead Lions, and I thought, I've just stolen that wholesale from Le Carre. You're quite right. That is a borrowing, as we like to call it in. I had no influence over who the ISIS Audio, who do the Audible books, chose as their narrator, but they couldn't have chosen a better one. Sean Barrett is wonderful, and he's done all of those, all the Slough House books and some of the short stories as well. I've met him a couple of times. He's a lovely guy. We had hoped to record a conversation together to go as to go onto the end of one of the recordings, but then that was just before lockdown struck, and we've never been able to get together to do that since. But we hope to do that one day. Yeah, he is wonderful. I'm very, very lucky to have him. Yeah.
It's fascinating. Now, we've got time for one more bonus question. There was one extra hand. There we go. I'm going to run over a tiny bit on this one because it's our last session.
Hello. The books that you write, they're very believable. There's sort of seems like technical things that are inside there that are, maybe you do come across it in your daily life, but you know, when you're talking about a bomb potentially in a particular location, or you know, a really difficult hostage scenario, do you get kind of technical help with that, or is it all from your own scary head?
All this shit up. I really do.
I'm very glad to hear it.
I mean, in some ways, I'm not particularly proud of that. Most other writers work a lot harder than I do, and they have contacts, and they do reach out to people and reach out to experts and learn things. And I'm just too lazy. I mean, I see my job as putting sentences together and making paragraphs. Paragraphs are where I like to be. They're my playground. And I don't want to spend any of my time doing any work, doing any real work, you know. So no, I do make it up, and all I'm relying on is, I mean, I've read a lot of books, I've seen a lot of movies, I've watched, you know, TV, and it just comes from there. I think like a lot of writers, the ability to read a news story about something and pick out one tiny detail to think, yeah, I can do that, I can use that, is a handy one to have. So a lot of stuff that I put in that looks like I'm an expert on something is one tiny little detail that I've stolen from a newspaper, essentially. Yeah.
I think either do the research afterwards or don't do it at all.
Yeah.
Well, brilliant question. What a great place to end. I know, isn't it fantastic? That was just brilliant. Yeah, make stuff up. That's really what it's all about, isn't it? Thank you so much, Declan Hughes and Mick Herron. You are our closing event for Murder One 2022. We hope to be back next year with a bit of support. Let's hope from the Arts Council and again from Dún Laoghaire Libraries. They're the people who've been able to give us the funding in order to put this event on and to go out to you, the live audience, but also to our online audience. So thank you very much indeed for attending and supporting, and thank you guys online for attending and supporting, and hopefully we'll all be able to see you soon. We have books upstairs for you, for Mick to sign. Trying to make sure to get my words in the right order, and we'll be whisking him upstairs in 1 second. So if you'd like to go upstairs, and you might be able to get a picture as well.
Can I just say what a fantastic weekend this has been? It's been absolutely wonderful. I've been more nervous about this than I've been about events in a long time. That's because I've seen the very, very high standard of stuff that's been going on. People being intelligent and articulate all day long made me really worried about sitting here and having to continue making stuff up. So I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I have. It's been a fantastic time. So thank you, Sam. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Pablo's topped me off. We'll see you upstairs. Thank you very much indeed.